Imagine waking up in a world where the word history has no meaning. No wars, no heroes, no revolutions, no legends. Everything that ever happened before 1999, gone. No one remembers. No records, no archives, no shared past. Just a collective amnesia so deep, it reshaped the human experience itself. What would life look like if humanity had to start over? Not from scratch, but from the moment they forgot where they came from. Let's enter a reality where the calendar reads 2000. But civilization is drifting through time without a compass. It's the year 2000, but not the one we know. In this alternate timeline, something extraordinary occurred. Every book, every file, every archive, and every personal memory of the past, gone overnight. There's no explanation, no cause, and no way to recover what was lost. Humanity was left standing in a new millennium, with no context for how they got there. No one remembers the Roman Empire, the World Wars, or even the dawn of electricity. All knowledge prior to 1999 has vanished from minds and machines alike. People still remember their own names, languages, and the layout of their homes. But anything tied to a wider world vanished. Like waking up from a coma with no past to cling to. Society did not collapse instantly, but it fractured. Without shared understanding of history, nations lost meaning. Beliefs became guesswork. And for the first time in thousands of years, humanity faced the future without the weight or guidance of the past. In this new reality, humanity isn't rebuilding what was. It's reinventing everything. Culture, governance, economy, even morality itself. This is a world unshaped by ancestors, unanchored by tradition, and unlimited by precedent. But without history to unite us, would we drift apart or evolve into something entirely new? Let's begin where it all resets, with the collapse of shared memory and culture. The first shockwave wasn't physical, it was psychological. Imagine entire nations waking up to find their museums empty, their libraries blank, their monuments meaningless. Statues stood tall, but no one remembered who they were. Flags waved, but their origins were mysteries. Even spoken words like democracy, religion, or revolution began to lose their meaning, detached from any historical foundation. Without context, identity collapsed. People still belonged to families, but what those families had once stood for. Cultural traditions, ancestral pride, even surnames tied to history meant nothing. Communities became cultural islands, isolated not by geography, but by disconnection from every timeline and narrative that once bound them together. This wasn't just the loss of knowledge, it was the death of meaning. Music still existed, but the roots of genres were forgotten. Was jazz revolutionary? Was classical sacred? No one knew. People sang what sounded good, played what resonated. New styles emerged from scratch, without knowing they were reinventing wheels long rolled. Language became fragmented too. Without historical references, many words fell out of use or mutated rapidly. Expressions like Rome wasn't built in a day or crossing the Rubicon became incomprehensible. Schools, scrambling to function, had no curriculum. They couldn't teach what didn't exist anymore. The result? Cultures began developing along drastically different lines. City by city, even neighborhood by neighborhood. What one group now considered sacred, another viewed as irrelevant. What one community banned, another celebrated. This wasn't just diversity, it was detachment. Global culture, once interconnected through shared media and historical understanding, shattered into thousands of isolated microcultures evolving independently. Over time, communities developed their own creation myths. Some believed the world began in the year 2000, born from a divine reset. Others thought an apocalyptic event erased all before them. Some just accepted the blankness and moved on, no longer asking what came before. There were no historians, only speculators. Conspiracy replaced legacy. A cracked photograph might be interpreted as a religious icon. A dusty globe could spark arguments about whether the Earth is flat or round. Not out of ignorance, but because no one knew anymore. And yet, this cultural isolation had strange side effects. Without global comparisons or expectations, creativity exploded. Fashion was invented from nothing. Traditions were built in real time. Cities forged their own holidays, rituals, and customs. People stopped imitating what they could no longer remember and started crafting meaning from the now. But the deeper tragedy lingered. Humanity could no longer look back to understand itself. There were no lessons from Auschwitz, no inspiration from Gandhi, no awe from the moon landing. The echoes of triumph and terror alike had been erased. All that remained was the present and the pressure to make it up as they went. With no cultural anchors left, the question wasn't how people preserved their identities, but how they would recreate them. And that began with rewriting the rules of morality and social behavior from scratch. In a world with no history books, no ancient texts, and no moral traditions to reference, ethics had to be redefined from the ground up. Without the weight of religious doctrines, political manifestos, or philosophical canon, every community became an ethical laboratory, crafting rules of behavior based not on what was taught, but on what worked. Some settlements became radically communal. Without capitalism or socialism as ideological references, they simply shared everything because it made sense in the moment. Others enforced strict hierarchies based on roles. Leaders weren't elected, they emerged often through charisma or necessity. Crime and punishment varied wildly. In one region, theft might result in exile. In another, it could spark rehabilitation efforts rooted in empathy and collective healing. There were no prisons because there was no inherited concept of one. Sexual norms and relationships also fractured in unpredictable ways. With no institutions like marriage tied to religious or historical precedent, people began to forge their own standards. Some groups adopted fluid, polyamorous arrangements. Others formed rigid codes of exclusivity for emotional security. Gender roles became highly localized, shaped entirely by immediate social feedback rather than ancient expectations. What was considered right or wrong often depended on the survival needs of the group. If trust helped the community thrive, honesty was sacred. If deception helped avoid danger, cunning was celebrated. There was no unified moral compass, only evolving adaptive value systems molded by trial and error. Interestingly, some of the same moral instincts humanity had always carried. Kindness, loyalty, fairness resurfaced even without context. But without history to confirm why these traits mattered, they were often treated with suspicion. Was generosity a strength or a weakness to be exploited? Was sacrifice noble or foolish? In the absence of past genocides, crusades, and injustices, there were no cautionary tales to guide social evolution. And so, the same mistakes began to repeat, not identically, but in spirit. Xenophobia flared between regions with differing customs. Some communities began purging unusual behavior. Others welcomed diversity until it destabilized their fragile harmony. But perhaps the most haunting development was how some societies came to worship the unknown itself. Shrines were built to the forgotten. Rituals formed around the mystery of 1999. The very absence of history became sacred. A blank canvas venerated by those who found power in forgetting. Without a shared moral legacy, humanity became morally diverse to the extreme. Ethical relativism wasn't a debate, it was a fact of life. In one city, mercy might be the highest virtue. In another, dominance. And yet in both, people believed they were doing the right thing because they had nothing to compare it to. And just as ethics were rebuilt from scratch, so too was the human relationship with technology, evolving not as a continuation, but as a rediscovery of what machines could do and how far they could go without a manual. In this world, with no historical context, technology didn't advance, it mutated. without documentation, schematics, or records of past inventions. Humans were surrounded by the physical remnants of the 20th century, but had no idea what most of it did. Devices blinked, screens glowed. Engines rumbled, but their purpose and principles were mysteries. People began reverse engineering from what they could see. A community might figure out how to power up a diesel generator without knowing what diesel even was. Others might repurpose smartphones into flashlights, paperweights, or tools to play music, never realizing they once connected the world. Satellites blinked in the night sky, completely useless to a species that had forgotten what they were built for. Because of this technological confusion, innovation didn't follow a linear path. It zigzagged. Some groups managed to recreate rudimentary computers using scavenged parts, but without programming knowledge, they used them as calculators or digital storage. Others stumbled upon water purification systems and turned them into sacred fountains, believing the machines created blessed water rather than filtered it. Without historical figures like Tesla, Turing, or Einstein, there were no heroes to emulate, only instinct and observation. Children growing up without textbooks instead experimented with scraps, fusing wires, mixing chemicals, and observing the effects with the curiosity of newborn alchemists. Out of this chaos, entirely new forms of innovation began to appear. Certain communities bypassed fossil fuel entirely, turning instead to solar panels left behind, rediscovered not for environmental reasons, but because they worked without noise. Others invented pulley-based transport systems rather than reinvent the car, because the principles of internal combustion were simply too complex to recover. In this world, bicycles might become more valued than airplanes. Simplicity won out over sophistication. Innovation became profoundly local. One coastal village might master wind energy through experimentation, while a nearby inland city relied on hand-powered machines and livestock. The concept of global standard in technology ceased to exist. Devices, tools, and entire infrastructures were often one-of-a-kind creations, working in one place but unintelligible to outsiders. And yet, despite the fractured state of tech, curiosity burned brighter than ever. There were no patents, no corporate monopolies, no copyright infringement. Anyone could experiment. Anyone could build. Trial and error, not competition or profit, became the main force behind technological progress. A child's toy in one region might inspire an entire movement of invention in another. Some innovations became legendary, passed down like folklore. Not through documents, but through oral tradition. Stories of a glowing box that could speak, or a tower that made voices travel through the air. Whether those stories led to discovery or myth-making didn't matter. They sparked imagination in a world starved of context. The irony. Some of the most advanced technology of the 20th century became useless, while the most basic and adaptable tools were reborn with reverence. In this vacuum, humanity didn't rebuild the internet. They built their version of it, something slower, stranger, and rooted in need, not legacy. And as communities harnessed what little they could from their technological relics, a new question emerged. How do you govern a world with no history, no ideology, and no blueprint for leadership? Without the memory of monarchies, republics, communism, fascism, or democracy, humanity had no political blueprint. The collapse of historical context meant no inherited ideologies. Only the immediate necessity to organize, survive, and avoid chaos. Leadership wasn't earned through elections or divine right. It was improvised, chosen, or seized depending on circumstance. In some places, the strongest took control. In others, the wisest. Some communities defaulted to the loudest, mistaking charisma for competence. Without any political science background, new power structures evolved like social experiments. Some tribal, others collective, many unstable. A coastal settlement might form a rotating council, where leadership changed weekly to prevent corruption, though they had no idea what corruption historically meant. Meanwhile, A mountainous enclave might be ruled by a single matriarch, who earned her position through resource management and practical wisdom, revered more like a folk deity than a bureaucrat. Some communities voted, without ever using the word election. Others created rituals to choose leaders by lottery, chance, or even games, seeing randomness as divine will. And in a few darker corners of the world, autocracy naturally evolved. Not from cruelty, but from the desperate need for fast decisions during famine, disaster, or internal conflict. There were no international laws, no Geneva Conventions, no treaties. Every community was effectively a sovereign state, with borders as informal as their ideologies. Sometimes trade was peaceful. Other times, it led to conflict. Without historical knowledge of global wars or diplomacy, groups negotiated with primitive caution, unsure if outsiders were friends, rivals, or something in between. Interestingly, some political systems mirrored long-forgotten ones, but not through legacy, only through convergence. The idea of checks and balances resurfaced in places where corruption started to rot early governments. The concept of justice courts arose independently in communities seeking conflict resolution. It was a quiet reminder that even without memory, some political ideas are simply practical enough to reappear. However, ideological extremism also thrived in some regions. Without a history of failed utopias or dystopian horrors to guide them, some groups pursued radical experiments unchecked. A town might embrace absolute collectivism, only to implode under starvation. Another might adopt rigid hierarchies based on age, with the oldest commanding unquestioned authority until death. In the absence of philosophical texts and centuries of governance theory, people governed based on instinct, trial, and consequence. There was no political left or right, just choices. Some wise, some devastating. And so the world fractured not only culturally and technologically, but politically. Thousands of governance models coexisted, sometimes peacefully, often not, and with no United Nations to call for dialogue. War and diplomacy were driven by personal relationships, not grand ideologies. Yet something remarkable happened. In some parts of the world, leaders ruled not through fear, but through service. People followed them because they solved problems, not because they demanded obedience. Without history's power struggles casting shadows, leadership returned to its simplest form, being useful. But no system of governance survives without a foundation of trade and with no global currency or economic theory left behind. Humanity would now rediscover value the old-fashioned way, through barter and necessity. With banks abandoned, currencies meaningless, and no memory of capitalism, socialism, or any economic framework, humanity's understanding of value reset entirely. Coins and bills were still found, but with no agreed-upon worth, they were reduced to shiny metal and colorful paper. Gold held no inherent prestige. Credit cards were inert plastic. The economy, once a global engine, reverted to its most primitive form: barter. Trade became hyperlocal. A farmer with surplus vegetables traded with a craftsman who built tools. A healer exchanged herbs for shelter. People didn't work for abstract income. They worked to survive, to be useful, to secure favors and form bonds. Economies didn't grow in the traditional sense. They adapted, moment by moment, to the needs of their communities. Different regions developed wildly different economic microcultures. One forested village might treat woven cloth as the highest commodity, while a coastal port might place premium value on dried fish or purified water. Without market reports, prices fluctuated constantly based on rumor, season, and desperation. Scarcity dictated demand. If a drought hit, water traders rose in power. If someone rediscovered soap making, they could practically name their price. Some areas invented tokens or shells as symbolic placeholders, slowly reinventing currency without knowing it. Others kept meticulous ledgers of trade in stone or cloth, forming rudimentary accounting systems based on trust and honor. Fraud was policed not by laws, but by reputation. If you cheated, no one traded with you again. And in a survival-based economy, exile was a death sentence. The absence of financial institutions had profound effects. There were no corporations, no ads, no stock market. No financial crashes. Without interest or debt, people didn't accumulate wealth, they circulated it. Some communities even rejected the idea of individual ownership, treating tools, land, and livestock as shared resources for the common good. Not out of ideology, but because it worked. However, not all systems were equitable. In places where resources were scarce, trade was monopolized by whoever controlled access. Water barons, food gatekeepers, medicinal brokers. A single beekeeper could become a king simply by controlling the only honey supply in a 50-mile radius. Power and trade intertwined tightly, giving rise to new forms of oligarchy, even without the concept of one. Still, the ingenuity of survival economics shone through. Some groups invented time-based economies, trading hours of labor instead of goods. Others developed trust economies, where social contribution earned access to shared assets. These systems often succeeded not because they were designed, but because they emerged organically. One of the most profound changes was how people viewed labor itself. With no jobs in the modern sense, work became integrated into community life. People did what they were good at. There were no resumes, no interviews, no payrolls, just recognition of value through action. Your worth wasn't in what you earned, but what you offered. Barter, of course, had limits. As communities expanded, the need for standardized exchange returned. Some settlements quietly began printing their own currencies again, scraps of paper with agreed-upon meaning. They weren't recreating money. They were reinventing it from instinct. This patchwork of local economies created a world with no middle class, no billionaires, no corporations, but also no social mobility in the traditional sense. Value was localized, fragile, and constantly shifting. A carpenter could be a prince in one town and penniless in the next. But as people found new ways to survive through trade, something deeper was also changing: how they related to each other. Without national identities or shared stories, human connection itself began to evolve in ways history had never seen. Without the unifying threads of history, nationalism, religion, or cultural mythology, humanity no longer saw itself as part of something bigger. There were no nations to pledge allegiance to, no ancestors to honor, no ideological banners under which to rally. What was left was something far more intimate and far more unstable: the immediate community. Social relationships, once shaped by centuries of inherited expectations, were now forged in the fire of circumstance. People formed bonds based not on tradition, but on necessity and chemistry. Friendships, romantic connections, and even family structures became experiments in survival and meaning. The nuclear family faded in many regions. In its place, clusters of individuals, chosen families, emerged, shaped by trust and mutual aid rather than bloodlines or marriage contracts. Marriage itself became a foreign concept in many places. With no religious or historical pressure, people redefined commitment in countless ways. Some cultures practiced lifelong partnerships forged through shared tasks. Others encouraged fluid relationships that adapted based on personal growth or community needs. Fidelity, cohabitation, even parenting, everything was negotiated in real time without precedent. Gender roles also transformed radically. Without traditional stories, texts, or expectations to reinforce stereotypes, many communities embraced fluidity as a natural state. In some villages, child-rearing became a shared responsibility regardless of gender or relationship. In others, individuals identified by their skills: hunter, healer, builder, rather than man, woman, or non-binary. Identity wasn't about labels, it was about contribution and choice. And in the absence of history, prejudice became unpredictable. In some areas, difference was celebrated. People who looked or acted differently were seen as gifts from the forgotten time. In others, unfamiliar traits became reasons for suspicion, especially in isolated settlements where conformity was key to survival. Without the memory of past civil rights movements or social justice struggles, inclusion had to be rediscovered, or in some cases, relearned the hard way. Communication, too, shifted dramatically. Without global media or unified educational systems, language began to splinter. Dialects mutated quickly. New slang formed every few years. Travelers between regions sometimes needed interpreters just 100 miles apart. The idea of a shared global language like English faded fast. Words were local. Meaning was situational. Miscommunication became common, but so did innovation in how people expressed emotions, needs, and stories. Interestingly, the concept of community became more felt than formal. People didn't belong to a country, they belonged to a place, a street, a farm. A group you were judged not by your origin, but by your presence. Did you help? Were you kind? Could you be trusted when things got hard? These became the criteria for belonging. But this also created new kinds of tension. Without national frameworks or laws to mediate conflict, communities had to invent their own forms of justice, often heavily reliant on social consensus. Gossip became power. Exile became punishment. Forgiveness, in some places, was institutionalized. In others, vengeance ruled. Festivals, celebrations, and rituals arose to fill the vacuum of shared experience. Each town, each cluster of people developed their own holidays, often tied to seasonal changes, community milestones, or simply the survival of another year. Without historical anniversaries or religious calendars, time became human-scaled, remembered only as far back as the living could recall. What emerged was a world simultaneously more intimate and more fragmented than the one before. Relationships were deeper, but smaller in scale. Communities were tighter, but more isolated. Identity was elastic, unshaped by centuries of echo. And in the silence left by forgotten history, the question became louder. Who are we if we don't remember who we were? As humanity rebuilt its connections, one bond at a time. The planet itself offered its own lesson, one not from history, but from lived experience. Respect the earth or pay the price. In the absence of industrial history, environmental disasters, or climate science, humanity had no inherited awareness of ecological fragility. There were no warnings about global warming, no tales of deforestation, no documentaries about melting ice caps. But what they did have was direct experience, and that, over time, proved to be its own kind of teacher. The Earth didn't forget what humans once did to it. Landfills still dotted the edges of cities. Oceans still carried plastic. Skies still bore the faint smog of a past no one remembered. At first, people simply ignored these relics, assuming they were natural or dismissing them as ruins from a vaguely before time. But as crops failed, fish populations dwindled, and rainfall patterns grew erratic. A painful truth emerged. The world was wounded, and no one knew why. This time, environmentalism wasn't a movement, it was survival instinct. When the river ran brown, people stopped using it. When a forest died from unseen pollution, nearby communities fled. When a town noticed sickness correlated with certain materials or runoff, they banned those items without understanding the science, only the consequence. In this world, nature wasn't romanticized. It was respected with caution. People learned quickly. Over-harvest the land, and it stops giving. Poison the air, and you stop breathing. The earth became an unpredictable god, punishing ignorance with droughts, floods, or famine. Without global agencies or weather forecasts, everything depended on local observation and memory. If elders remembered a certain fungus ruining last year's crops, their word became law. Some communities, especially those in close proximity to obvious environmental scars, became aggressively eco-conscious. They planted trees not for aesthetics, but for shade, soil repair, and food. Waste was composted or transformed into tools. Rivers were cleaned not as acts of virtue, but because clean water meant fewer deaths. Sustainability wasn't a philosophy, it was a necessity. Interestingly, without a history of industrial consumerism, many groups never even conceived of waste the way we once did. Items were repaired endlessly. Tools were handed down, repurposed, or melted into new things. Packaging was minimal or non-existent. A single jar might serve a family for years. Landfills became cautionary zones, monuments to an unknown civilization that destroyed and discarded in equal measure. The idea of nature as something separate from humanity also faded. Without Enlightenment thinkers or romantic poets to frame the earth as a thing to be conquered or admired, people saw themselves as part of the ecosystem. Some regions developed animistic beliefs that forests had spirits, or rivers could curse those who disrespected them. Others relied on empirical observation. Certain birds disappearing meant a storm was coming. A spike in insect population warned of soil imbalance. Of course, not every area succeeded. In some parts of the world, desperate people stripped the land bare, trying to survive. They hunted species to extinction. They mined, burned, and consumed without understanding the long-term cost. These places often became uninhabitable within a generation, forcing survivors to migrate and learn anew. Yet, in the broader arc of this new world, a strange pattern emerged, without industrial greed or economic systems demanding infinite growth. Many societies settled into rhythms of balance, not because they were noble, but because the earth would not let them forget their place within it. And as the planet quietly imposed its own lessons, the next generation would grow up with a radically different understanding of what education was. Even though they had no textbooks, no classrooms, and no history to teach. In a world without history, education wasn't about remembering the past. It was about surviving the present. Gone were lectures about ancient empires, memorization of dates, or standardized exams. There were no universities, no scholars, no theories of education to copy. What emerged instead was something raw, immediate, and brutally efficient. Knowledge forged from necessity. Children didn't sit in rows. They followed adults into the fields, the rivers, the workshops. Learning wasn't separated from life. It was life. A child in a farming village would know how to identify soil quality by age 5. Another in a coastal region could read the tides better than any ancient mariner by 7. Education was apprenticeship, trial and error, and oral tradition passed down not by teachers, but by survivors. Reading and writing didn't vanish, but they evolved. In many places, written language fragmented or simplified. The alphabet was rediscovered in pieces, symbols etched on scrap metal, chalk on stone, paint on wood. Communities developed their own shorthand, sometimes only understood by a single generation. In others, drawing and gesturing became dominant. Literacy existed, but in wildly mutated forms. There were no subjects like history, philosophy, or political science. Instead, there were lessons titled How to Build a Shelter, What Not to Eat, or How to Treat a Burn. Some settlements institutionalized these learnings, creating makeshift schools in abandoned buildings or open-air plazas. Lessons were taught through storytelling, games, or repetition of rituals rather than structured curriculum. Knowledge was hyper-local. One region might develop advanced techniques for vertical farming using repurposed urban ruins. Another might perfect a method for preserving food using saltwater and clay. There was no best practice, only what works here, now. Communities would guard their innovations like treasure or trade them with others, fostering an underground network of ideas and survival tips. Critical thinking was taught not as an academic exercise, but as a survival trait. Children were encouraged to ask why, not about metaphysics, but about tools, choices, and consequences. Why did the roof collapse? Why did the animals flee? Why did that mixture cause an explosion? Every question had the potential to make life easier or to save a life entirely. Math was often reborn from scratch. Counting systems varied. Some villages used fingers, others rocks, knots, or painted dots on wood. Arithmetic developed as a tool to divide food, measure materials, or estimate travel time. Not for equation's sake, but because not knowing how to count could cost you everything. One of the most profound shifts came in how people perceived knowledge itself. With no written record of experts, no icons of brilliance like Newton or Curie or Hawking, everyone became a student and a teacher. An elder who knew how to keep bees was a scientist. A child who discovered how to trap smoke to preserve meat was a prodigy. Intelligence was no longer academic. It was applied. And failure wasn't punished. It was expected. Communities embraced failure as the first step of understanding. A broken tool meant a better one could be made. A collapsed structure meant the next would be stronger. Without grades or performance anxiety, curiosity flourished. You didn't graduate, you simply became useful. Over time, some settlements began collecting their knowledge, carving it into stone tablets, weaving it into songs, or painting it onto long strips of fabric. This wasn't history in the traditional sense. It was instruction, guidance for whoever came next, not to glorify the past, but to prevent repeating mistakes. In this new world, education was not about shaping citizens or workers. It was about shaping contributors, people who could build, heal, protect, and innovate. Without historical baggage, the pursuit of knowledge became unshackled from prestige and returned to its core purpose: survival and betterment. And now, as we step back and look at this entire world built from forgetting, we ask the ultimate question: what does it mean to lose history? And what kind of humanity rises from the ashes? When the past was erased in 1999, humanity didn't collapse. It rebooted. In the absence of guidance, it stumbled, it suffered, and it searched. But over time, something remarkable happened. The human spirit, freed from centuries of baggage, prejudice, and presumption, began to explore new ways of being. Better or worse, just different. Without history, people stopped looking backward. They learned to look around, to feel, to adapt. They weren't building new versions of old systems. They were forging something original, something terrifying, something beautiful. A patchwork world of 1,000 micro-civilizations, each shaped by climate, need, and instinct, not legacy or dogma. They didn't remember the Holocaust, but they rediscovered compassion through shared suffering. They didn't study democracy, but they built councils to represent their voices. They didn't know what sustainability meant, but they learned to respect the earth because it punished them when they didn't. And they didn't revere education, but they taught their children how to survive, thrive, and ask questions. The irony? In forgetting everything, humanity had a rare chance to become something entirely new. And in many ways, it did. A civilization without inheritance. A species without identity. A world without history, yet still, somehow, a future. Because in the end, humanity didn't need its past to remember how to be human. It just needed time, pain, and the will to imagine forward. What if this isn't just fiction? What if, right now, the stories we tell, the histories we preserve, and the knowledge we pass down are more fragile than we think? What if the loss of context isn't a fantasy, but a risk? A silent erasure waiting to happen, not by magic, but by neglect. If you found yourself in a world like this, would you know how to build again? Would you preserve meaning, or would you help reinvent it? If that idea stirred something in you, then take a moment to reflect. Like, share, subscribe. Let others wonder too what kind of world would rise from the ashes of forgetting. And more importantly, what kind of world are we building right now? The future is always being written. Let's make sure we don't let it slip away.